was not very fond of plants. One of his jobs was to weed the lawn. And it was a job that Steve didn't like very much. The harder it was to get the weeds up, the less Steve liked them, and the more he thought that plants were just a terrible nuisance. But then, who should come along but the mailman? Now, there was nothing so unusual about this, but today there was a postcard for Steve. Steve began to feel happier until he read the card. Dear Steve, do you remember our talk about helpful plants? One of mine has a fine present all ready for you. Come and visit the farm soon. Uncle Ben. Helpful plants. That was just like Uncle Ben. Steve knew there was nothing helpful about weeds. He didn't think there could be such a thing as a helpful plant. But if we look around Steve's front yard, we can find quite a few helpful plants, can't we? Well, by the time Steve had done his weeding for the day, he was curious about what Uncle Ben had for him. So, with Mother's permission, he started off to Uncle Ben's to find out about that helpful plant. But he was still pretty cross about the weeds, so he didn't even notice all the useful plants he was passing on the way. By the time Steve reached the edge of town, he was pretty hot. So he decided to stop and cool off in the shade of a big tree. Shade. That's what trees are good for, Steve thought. And for climbing. And of course, he knew that a tree is a plant. From the tree, he could see Mrs. Jones working in her garden. Of course, that's hard work. But these are helpful plants, aren't they? Vegetables for us to eat. And look, some of them are for sale. Let's see. We eat the roots of some vegetables, potatoes and carrots and beets. And the leaves of others. Cabbage and lettuce. Some vegetables grow seeds that we eat, such as beans and corn. We eat the stems of broccoli and celery. And these vegetables we eat are really the seed pods of plants. Steve decided that vegetables are pretty helpful plants. He wondered if Uncle Ben was going to give him some vegetables. Well, he'd just have to go on and find out. But he went slower now, and he kept watching for ways that plants help us. Look, a new house, a house made of wood. And wood, you know, comes from trees. What else could Steve see that was made of wood? There's a picket fence, and the telephone poles. Then Steve thought of another way trees help us. Did you know that paper and cardboard are made from wood? Yes, trees are useful in many ways, aren't they? But surely Uncle Ben didn't mean to give Steve anything made of wood or paper. So he rode on, thinking about helpful plants. Why, look, bicycle tires are made of rubber. Does rubber come from a plant? Rubber trees grow in faraway lands where it is hot and moist. Rubber is made from the sap of these trees. Do you know what plant this is? This is cotton. When the fluffy balls of cotton have been combed, they are spun into thread and woven into cloth. Cotton is made into all sorts of clothing, and strong, long-wearing play clothes, too. Can you think of other kinds of cloth that come from plants? Well, Steve didn't think long about cloth. He saw some cows in a pasture, and he began to think about milk. Now, milk doesn't come from plants. But what are the cows eating? Why, grass, of course. And grass is a plant. Pigs furnish us with meat. And what do they eat? Corn, that's a plant. And chickens that give us fried chicken or scrambled eggs, they eat grain from plants. By the time Steve reached Uncle Ben's farm, he was thinking that plants can be mighty helpful. How many ways do you see that plants are helpful here? The table is made of wood from a what? Steve drank milk from a cow that ate what? And he ate fresh bread made from... Do you know how bread is made? Well, one of the things Uncle Ben grows on the farm is wheat. When the wheat is ripe, it is harvested. The hard, dry seeds are taken from the stalks. At the mill, the wheat seeds are poured into huge machines. They are cleaned and crushed and ground into tiny, tiny bits of flour. At the end, we can see the sack being filled with flour from the mill. At the bakery, the flour is mixed with milk and butter and yeast. Then it is baked into bread. So you see, we need plants so we can have bread, too. But Steve was enjoying his bread and milk so much that he almost forgot why he had come to the farm. But when Uncle Ben came over from the barn, Steve remembered. What was Uncle Ben going to give him? Well, first they looked around the farm together. They looked at the cornfield, where Uncle Ben grew food for his cows for next winter. But Steve didn't want any corn. They looked at the apple orchard and saw how many apples there were on the trees. Steve would agree that the apple tree is a helpful plant, but it wasn't the one Uncle Ben wrote about. Then they looked at some new trees Uncle Ben had planted. But he didn't give Steve a tree. Finally, Uncle Ben showed Steve some plants he had never seen before. They didn't look like much to Steve. They didn't have any berries or seed pods. Do you know what they are? Peanuts. So that was the present one of the helpful plants had for Steve. There were enough peanuts here for a couple of boys. So, after Steve had roasted the peanuts at home, he and his brother enjoyed them. And that's how Steve learned about some of the many ways that plants help us. Now, can you think of other ways?